All right, everybody. I do believe we are live. Welcome to another episode of the Break the Rules live stream. I am your host, Lev Polyakov at LevPo on X, and we are here with a returning guest, the great and powerful Auron MacIntyre, tapper of signs, and writer of the new book, which I highly encourage everybody to read, The Total State, How Liberal Democracies Became Tyrannies, out right now on Amazon and probably other places as well. And we have another author. We have two bookmen today. We have the great Devon Eriksen, author of Theft of Fire, an amazing sci-fi book. There it is, which I'm currently reading right now. And what's initially inspired me to do this program for everybody today was a particular tweet that Mr. Eriksen made, which talked about fascism as being a product of disgust, while communism is a product of this overall permissiveness. And what I want to try to figure out, and I've had conversations like this with Auron before, is how can we get out of this state which seems to be going into this state of communism without succumbing to this reactionary fascism. So without further ado, I would love to start out with the newcomer, Devon. Please tell us about yourself, about your work as a writer, and then where exactly you think we are right now, given the recent protests/riots that occurred in D.C. the other day, and what exactly you think this is leading up to, and what exactly you anticipate is going to be the reaction to this, knowing what happened in history, and then we're going to bring it to Auron. But before that, if you guys have not subscribed, click the subscribe button, like the video, comment in the chat, and all that good stuff. Anyway, Devon, go ahead.
Well, that is a lot of questions, so I will deal with them in order. I am Devon Eriksen, a retired software engineer and science fiction writer. And most of the way I sell books is my political commentary on X, which seems to get people interested in my writing. But the idea that we're talking about here is something that I sort of aggregated from bits and pieces of other people's thinking about this. And the idea is to understand communism and fascism not just as historical forces or political theories, but as psychology, as pieces of personal psychology, because any political system has to have supporters. So there's this idea that communism is an envy spiral, where people envy others who are doing better than them and wish to use the state to pull them down. And then because this process empowers them, they continue finding people to pull down, and they continue finding people to weaponize the state against. And then fascism is a disgust spiral. This idea that which is harmful to the individual and harmful to society, we have a disgust instinct to protect against it. Well, in the way fascism comes about is that there is a desire to purge that which is harmful or disgusting to society. There's this metaphor of the society as the body, and certain influences or people are seen as diseases or parasites, and we wish to purge the body of this. But when you have fascism, what happens is you purge that which is truly disgusting. Then your disgust threshold is raised through this process because you're constantly focusing on what's disgusting. And then you become disgusted by the next thing and the next and the next. And so these two opposite spiraling processes are how we get these sayings that communism is, when ugly, deformed freaks make it illegal to be normal and kill all the normal people out of envy and spite. And fascism is when boring normie dullards make it illegal to be weird and kill all the creative and interesting people out of knee-jerk reactionary fear.
So, Oren, do you agree with this statement pretty much? Or do you have certain qualms about it?
There's quite a few qualms. Devon is right to acknowledge that there is a general, disgust versus uh, grievance. Sorry, what did he use specifically?
I said
Um,
envy, but
Envy.
grievance
Yeah,
works as well.
sure. Yeah. So he's right to identify that these are forces, social forces inside. You can look at Jonathan Haidt's work and talking about moral tastes and what people focus on in those to in the righteous mind to go ahead and lock some of that down if you'd like. I think there's a problem trying to abstract these very real forces into political philosophies or movements. Paul Gottfried has done a lot of work on the definition of fascism. I think he's made a pretty good case that it's a very specific historical reaction. It requires a large amount of context to properly understand. The same, I think, is true of communism. I think that it's not very useful to take either of these words out of their context, out of their actual socio historical context, and then try to turn them into abstract ways to understand political conflict, because both of these are representations of a particular reaction to massified liberal society. And when we try to just take those singular elements of disgust or grievance out of those and try to turn them into an entire political philosophy, we kind of discard all of the things that define those particular movements. So I'm fine discussing, those aspects of human nature, but I do think, and I make the jokes too, like the Mystery Grove tweet, that you quoted is great, right? That's a classic for a reason.
Yeah.
But I do think that, both left and right, conservatives and liberals both make the mistake of, calling everything they hate fascist or everything they hate communist. I don't think that really helps us move forward to our current situation in which neither of these are actually lived political theories.
Well, I think that tendency arises from sort of an impulse to identify the general underlying psychology behind a movement. So, perhaps if we look at that Mystery Grove tweet, what we're talking about is not communism in the historical sense, which is obviously very different from the sort of gay race communism we have today. The communists of modern America would be put up against the wall and shot by the communists of early 20th century Russia very quickly. But what we're trying to do is identify these kind of underlying impulses and social dynamics which are to some extent hardwired into the human genome, and therefore they present historically again and again and again, and they present differently. You'll have to excuse the constant tea. I've been on the convention circuit for several weeks, and you get the con crud. We try to identify these impulses which cause certain types of dynamics to manifest again and again and again throughout history, and to sort of understand them through the individual historical circumstances that make them a little bit this way or a little bit that way, depending on when in history they're manifesting and what the economic and technological state is. So it's very easy to get bogged down in this kind of discussion where someone will try to say something that is a little bit general, and then someone else will say, well, that's a generality. And of course, that's true. But everything is a generality. It's how we're able to have discussions in symbolic language at all. So I think generalizations like this need to be understood not as a total description of every nuance of the picture as what's happening today, but as a sort of a useful metaphor for understanding certain important things about what's driving what's going on today.
There's
Does
also
that make sense?
Well, there's also a caveat I wanted to add to that, which is I think that for people who are more in the neo-reaction scene, if you will, I don't think that they would want to have a repeat of the horrible things that went on in the 20th century. But I wonder if, in a way, the idea that, well, this was in a certain historical context, so, well, we're never going to see that again, if that idea is something that kind of keeps them from observing these very human repeating tendencies. And,
Well,
yeah.
So at the core of neo-reaction is actually a Pareto model, which outlines exactly the sociological underpinning that Devon's talking about. So no, it's not an attempt to evade any understanding here. The point is that I'm fine with discussing this. I just want to go ahead and outline that the labels communist and fascist come with a massive amount of baggage. And you're going to spend 95% of your time in any discussion on those topics going through the baggage. What I'm saying is choosing these terms as your frame, and I'm not going to spend the whole time arguing the frame, but I just want to make a point here. Choosing these terms as your frame does not, it does more to hinder the discussion than elucidate the discussion. I think it would be more profitable to frame it in terms of perhaps disgust versus envy, as opposed to communism versus fascism. As Devon has already said, those are the two dynamics he's pulling out of those ideologies anyway. So why not just discuss those dynamics rather than burden those dynamics with that particular baggage? That said, you can use whatever you want. I'm not here to police the language. I'm just saying, if you want to have a productive discussion, spending the entire time going, but fascism does this and communism does this, is a waste of your time. That's not
this is
really
sort of a fiction writer thing.
Yeah.
Fiction writers, we do this. We use tropes, and a trope is not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily a cliche. But when we use tropes, we have to understand that we run the risk of pulling in unwanted baggage, but we also gain the advantage of pulling in desired baggage. So, when we talk about communism, when we talk about fascism, we're having to cut through a certain amount of historical and sort of a historical record and historical reinterpretation, but we're also sort of pulling in an understanding that we can look at the past and what's happened. So I will agree with you that there are pros and cons here.
It's definitely good for the algorithm as opposed to terms that are a little bit more abstract, if you will.
Yeah. We have to, when we speak philosophy, we must make it relevant to the life of
philosophy
the everyday
for clicks.
person.
I get it. I understand.
Yeah.
Yes, but that being said, the idea here, I think, is trying to avoid these really bad outcomes that we have seen in the 20th century. And what we're seeing right now, this, weird gay race communism, whatever you want to call it. We have Kamala Harris being associated with these memes of She-Hulk twerking, this girl boss thing that's going on right now. And obviously that is not the same as the Red Army and the massacres that occurred, in my home country of Russia, a century ago. But the idea, I guess, from people who are more on the neo-reactionary end is that all of this is going to lead to some kind of horrible control system. Before we get to the reaction part of it, Auron, can you elucidate what you fear the most happening if we were to continue going into a Kamala Harris presidency, let's say, and beyond?
Sure. I guess it's just a continuation of trends that we have already seen. Obviously, we have a disastrous border policy that completely destroys everything that makes our country able to function. We don't have a solid tax base. We don't have any form of public health that we can actually enforce. We're allowing drugs. We're allowing sex trafficking across the border. We're disrupting neighborhoods. We are destroying the ability of the country to share a language. I mean, I don't know how long you want me to go on this, but we're neutering children at young ages with drugs and then actual physical mutilation. We're destroying the ability of families to form. We're ensuring that we hollow out the country by creating IQ shredders that go ahead and concentrate all of the leadership ability of the United States into cities rather than distributing it across communities that need it. Again, I could do this all day, but
Well, Devon, do you agree with Oren's view on this? And where exactly, to use the sci-fi writer's mind for a second, where exactly do you see it going if it keeps going in that direction?
Well, to abstract it a little bit, the political element of our society is definitely behaving in an anti-civilizational fashion. You have certain whenever you have a civilization, whenever you create a civilization, you have these apes who aren't really evolved for civilization, and then you want to make those apes live in a different way because there are tremendous technological and economic benefits to do so. And so you have to reconcile the instincts of a plains ape with the demands of a technological stack. And there's a great temptation on the part of intellectuals, and I would consider the political class to be intellectuals because their work product is ideas. There's a tremendous temptation on the part of these people to indulge in this sort of ego flattering delusion that human beings are blank slates and they can be arranged in any way we would like, however we would find convenient for whatever world we like to see. And then they start moving people around like chess pieces, and the fundamental sort of social dynamics between human beings start to break. If I could tap the sign, the sign I would tap at this moment would be that the human family and the human reproductive cycle are extremely fragile, and they require very, very specific conditions to form and thrive. And we don't necessarily understand what those conditions are exactly. They are deep lore. So when we try to socially engineer, we tend to stomp all over them. And I think that a lot of the individual things that Auron is pointing out are sort of aspects of that and things that are downstream of that. So yes, in general, I agree with his assessment of what the hazards are.
As far as what they end up turning into if people were to react to it, now we have these avatars, including Auron's, with the red color and the shining blue eyes glaring at you, as are other people who have the avatars of, as it's called, a dark MAGA. The idea that we have had enough of this trajectory that you two were talking about. But then, as far as how you react to it, you could react to it within our given set of laws, the Constitution, the amendments, or does it require, like, the only way to solve this, the only way to get rid of the problematic elements is something a lot more stringent? So let's go to Auron. What do you think it's going to take to move this into a better direction? Whatever you would define as better.
Yeah, again, it's always exciting to predict the future, but I think that we are obviously in a scenario where most of the institutions of the United States do not work properly, and in a manner, to a degree to which they are beyond reform as we understand it. That means that remaking of those institutions is critical if you're going to be able to go ahead and change anything, though I'm honestly rather skeptical that that can even be done at a nationwide level. As Devon pointed out, most of the social engineering is the problem. The fact that you are not allowing organic ways of being for peoples means that they are unlikely to create the exact cycle he's talking about necessary to go ahead and continue cultures and form families. And so if you're going to fix that problem, it's probably going to happen at a devolved level. It's probably going to need society to shrink down rather than scale up, which means that we're probably going to need to radically decentralize the operation of our political organization, which was, of course, the intention of the founders in the first place, though we've done a very, very, very bad job of doing that in the United States since the founding. So the solution, which I talk about in my book, for me, would be to radically devolve the authority and the level of human organization down to state and local levels, which would allow us to go ahead and be able to discard a large number of these decrepit institutions that do not serve the interests of the people they are supposed to serve, and will also allow for the more organic formation of families, while also blocking the ability of the wider state to go ahead and implement the social engineering that we were both worried about.
Now, before I get to Devon, the energy of Dark MAGA is not one that makes me think of, these open fields with decentralized people. It does feel a lot more like putting all of your energy into this point of concentration, which is Donald Trump. And like I recently had a really interesting conversation in the New York City studio with Raheem Kassam, which is going to be out soon, by the way, on BTR, and it's currently on patreon.com/breaktherules. But anyway, I had a conversation with him about Trump, wherein I didn't want to look at Trump as all the things that he currently did or things that he promises to do, but even in the longer time scale, if he has people that are going to be around him, let's say if he wins, who are going to be incredibly loyal, including people like J.D. Vance, who compared him to Hitler earlier on, but now have become like the most loyal of all. If somebody gets surrounded by people who end up being toadies, then I can imagine the state of that person ends up being much worse in the long term. You could say kind of like with Vladimir Putin, who's around people who tell him only the things that he wants to hear. And to me, that is a very dangerous recipe, because all the things that you're talking about with decentralization, like that's good, that's beautiful, Auron. But if so many people within your circle don't seem to have that much of a problem with putting all their energy into a strongman, this goes back to the point that Devon was talking about, like how exactly would you prevent this strongman from assuming so much control over people's lives that we're not even talking about these decentralized gardens and white picket fences and people working together anymore. We're talking about things being enforced from the top down. So before I get to Devon, Auron, any response to that?
Sure. I guess two things. One, you cannot break the power of a major system without an opposing major system. So what you're asking is, I want to shatter the current Leviathan, but I don't want to create another Leviathan. Cool, great. The only problem is, that's like saying, I'd like to fight a war with a country that has nuclear missiles, but I don't want to have nuclear missiles. Well, how does that work out for people? It doesn't, right? So if you want to cut the Gordian knot, you're going to need something that is not just your average politician. Now, the concern that you're expressing is one of autocratic power, right? Once you centralize power, how do you govern it? And the answer is you don't. And that's a terrifying thing for people. But how is that decentralized limitation working for you right now, right? We're pretending that the choice is between a completely tyrannical centralized power and a restrained decentralized power. That is not true. That's why I wrote a book about why decentralized powers can become tyrannical, because you don't actually only get tyranny from autocracy. You can get tyranny from democracy. You can get tyranny from oligarchy just fine. The idea that distributing power prevents tyranny is on its face false. And if you have any question about that, you're living through the example in which that is not true, right? You did not need a focused power to create the pandemic lockdowns that put you in your home for years, that forced vaccine mandates on people. You do not need a autocratic leader to create a scenario in which the government is mandating that someone go ahead and have their child take puberty blockers or have their genitals cut off lest they lose their child. Autocrats were not necessary to bring that about. So if your worry is that an autocrat could be too powerful, you are of course correct. But your desire is to place some form of sovereignty outside of the sovereign. This is the classic problem. The Odysseus problem is the classic problem of political philosophy. And guess what? Nobody has solved it yet. Democracy didn't solve it. The Republic has not solved it. Autocracy will not solve it either. We will always be subject to power, and we will always be vulnerable to corrupt rulers. And no governmental system bails you out of that problem.
Devon, your thoughts?
Okay. Well, the problem with listening to smart people is that you tend to have six different things that you want to say that get stored up as they talk. But I'm going to try to overview some of these briefly and then go into. So I don't necessarily agree that asymmetric conflict cannot be won. The natural enemy of the dinosaur is not always a bigger dinosaur. It can also be the small egg-eating mammal. But I do agree in principle that you always have the problem in society of force projection. In fact, this is probably the basic problem of society. And then when you create a government, that doesn't solve the problem of force projection. It just moves it into a new dimension, because now the means of force projection are control over the government. So there's a John Adams quote, and I can't really do it justice from memory, but he says that the laws that we have created will serve only to govern an intelligent, active, well-regulated Christian people. We can do no other. So, the quality of the government you have is never more than the average IQ and agency of the population that has to keep it in check. So I agree that there's a fundamental problem here that you're not going to solve with the tinkering of the system. But the problem we have now is not fundamental. It's a result of specific systems that are put in place, and we can do something about that. We may not be able to solve all of the philosophical problems of history, but we can certainly start throwing out people who are not supposed to be in this country. So,
and that's not an authoritarian approach. Just sorry to cut you off, but I just want to make that known for the people who think like, oh, that's like fascist. No, it's not. That's a very understandable thing.
It's entirely libertarian. Libertarianism is based on the notion of property and the right to exclude others.
Not according to the head of the Libertarian Party, actually.
You do not have... Well, anybody can call themselves the Libertarian Party. I can call myself Jesus Christ or a donkey or an egg.
Or a cat.
That doesn't make me one. I'm not a cat. So... you can call yourself the Libertarian Party, but that doesn't make you in any way libertarian, especially when you select a candidate whose most urgent priority is, I want people to be free to put stuff in their butts, which is, not only a freedom that is not under threat, it's practically a state religion right now. So, this is, a lot of people who call themselves libertarian are really only focused on the one liberty that they personally want to have for themselves. So I don't have much time for people like that. But the point that I wanted to get to, and this is a little bit of a very different slice through the apple than you were taking, is that we talk about the atrocities of the 20th century and how do we avoid that. And I would like to point out ways in which I believe that almost everything is downstream from technology. So I see a lot of the atrocities of the 20th century as consequences of the technological state of the 20th century. So if you look at history, say, going back to medieval Europe, you have monarchies. And the reason you have monarchies is because the state of control technology sort of spits this out automatically. Your pinnacle of military technology, your pinnacle of the ability to project force is the armored knight. And armored knights are very expensive, and they require a lot of servants to support and maintain them. So what this means is that the king, the sovereign, the ruler, doesn't really have to keep a lot of people happy in order to control the means of force projection. He can really just, rule in a way that pleases his henchmen and his knights, and everybody else kind of has to go along with that, because you can't fight an armored knight charging on his horse with a lance, with a sharpened farm implement. That's not going to work out too well for you. So what changes this? What brings along republics and democracy is not that some philosopher stood up and said, oh, well, autocracy is bad, actually. And everybody said, wow, we never thought of that. That's not how that happens. How that happens is somebody invents, not gunpowder, because gunpowder's been around a long time, but somebody invents rifling. And all of a sudden, a peasant with a very inexpensive stick can murk your armored knight from a distance of 100 yards. And now you have a state where you have to keep a lot more people happy in order to stay in power. So you exit the age of population control with direct force, and you enter the age of deception. And just as the technologies of the age of force are the armored knight, which is made obsolete by rifling, the technologies of the age of deception are radio and television. And radio and television are a one-to-many medium. You can't necessarily control the population through force anymore, but you can control them through controlling the dissemination of information. It's expensive to set up radio and television stations. It's expensive to disseminate this kind of information, and you can control the central nodes whereby that information is disseminated. So now you have things like historical fascism, and their very intimate relationship with propaganda, and you have historical communism and their very intimate relationship with propaganda, because the technology stack allowed them to control the means of information. All of the decisions you make are based on the information you have. Anybody who can control what you believe can control you. So it was very easy for the communists and the fascists and the liberal Democrats
yes,
to get everybody marching in the same direction with those night-destroying boomsticks. So again, you had a technology stack that favored a different kind of autocracy, and then that was the autocracy that you saw. Well, what I see happening right now is that the one-to-many communications technology is being replaced with a many-to-many communications technology. And if you want an example of that, just think a little bit about the podcast, we're doing right now. Nobody had to give us a lot of money or any permission to do this. We're just reaching out and talking to random strangers on the internet, and we don't even know who you are. Believe it or not, I can't see you through the screen. You're just whoever decided that this would be interesting. And this many-to-many communications medium brings an end to the age of deception, because you can no longer seize this single or these few points of control and determine what everybody thinks the facts are. Now you have random autists on Twitter replacing the function of journalism. And so you can no longer maintain a deceptive narrative without lots of people popping up to say, hey, wait a minute. So now what we may be entering is the age of persuasion, where power belongs to those who are able to create compelling stories that interpret facts in a way that benefits them.
Yet
and I see, I'm sorry, just one more thing. Mm-hmm. I see this sort of autocratic behavior, this kind of gay race communism. We're going to promote this kind of ideology or that kind of ideology, or we're going to censor these social media sites as being the old world, the boomers of the political class, sort of thrashing around in desperation, trying to figure out some way to adapt to the obsolescence of their old tools. And that's where you get these cringy, fake, grassroots memes about Harris and so forth.
Yeah, the coconuts and
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It is pretty cringe. But at the same time, since, like you mentioned, there are people who are into that kind of stuff. I go on Facebook, and I see a lot of these people who are in the film business.
The
they
memes
are
aren't for you. They're for retards.
Well, okay. I mean, when it does come, though, to the people who are on the other side, as I always tell Auron, I am still seeing a bubble here when it comes to certain things that they don't consider. And it doesn't mean that those things they don't consider are coming from the Kamala Harris camp. They're not. But at the same time, it still seems like people who are within a certain circle are going to be extremely reluctant to do or say anything that would be contrary to whatever's already been established as the belief system within that circle. And it seems like that is becoming a bigger and bigger congealing
tribalism.
Yeah, exactly. So
tribalism no longer based on the nation state, but based on the ideological internet group.
So as far as making sure that that doesn't lead to something really, really bad, Auron, any thoughts on this? Because, we have to be honest, we do have all these various tribes, and it's extremely difficult for people to adopt opinions that are contrary to whatever everybody else believes, and that's just a human thing. It also has to do with, keeping up the algorithm, getting a lot of likes. Like, if you were to one day go out and say something that would be totally antithetical, like one day something hit you, and you're like, oh my god, I was wrong about this, and now you go on X, you write a post, I'm not sure that would be welcomed by a lot of your audience, assuming that ever happens. So how do we as people fight that, that tendency to be tribal if we happen to stumble upon certain pieces of information that are actually correct and our group, let's say, is completely wrong about it?
I do that all the time, but I guess the real question here is tribalism a problem to be solved? And what do we mean by that? So, as Devon said, there is a nation state, right? This is what we think of as the political form of organization now, but that's not the case, right? We've destroyed the nation state. We've decided that actually nations should not exist inside states. In fact, all states should be multicultural, multi-ethnic. There is no nation state in the sense that was meant when nation state was actually created in the first place. So this is kind of an outmoded belief. In fact, the ideological state is what we have now. That's what America and many other nations have become. They are states bound together only by ideology. In fact, that's what people mean when they say the propositional nation in the United States. They mean a state of ideology, a state that is bound by principles and not by any shared ethnos or any shared nationhood that is traditionally understood inside human organization. So the idea that we're creating now these new tribes based on the ideology, we've been doing that for a long time. And what was the Cold War if not a creation of literally a bipolar order staked on top of ideology, right? It is actually the dismantling of that bipolar order that created the option for anything like a slightly more organic form of human organization, as Samuel Huntington talked about in Clash of Civilizations. So really, I'm not sure what the question here is. Will people have confirmation biases inside their social circles? Yes. Will social media feed that confirmation bias? Yes. Is that avoidable inside the algorithmic model of hyperreality? No, because it's literally what drives all engagement inside of those circles. So as long as these are tools with which most people interact all day, you will see a continued kind of building of this. Human beings are tribal. They seek to exclude. That is what they do. That is how societies are formed and how they function. You can have multinational empires. You can have multi-ethnic empires that operate peacefully and have peoples inside of them, but they tend to usually allow the different groups to govern themselves and then kick up to, for instance, a higher power, rather than meddle and try to socially engineer consensus among all of those. One of the reasons that our societies have been breaking apart is because we have worked so hard to socially engineer each group to fit into some kind of ideological conformity. Ironically, when people talk about fascism, that's probably the closest thing to actual fascism, where the identity of any given people has to be sublimated to the ideological adherence to a given state narrative. But that is what non-ideological states do now more often than any fascist government of the past.
Well,
Yeah,
to give
I'd
you
like
a quick,
to jump in here, if I may.
one second before you jump in, I consider Auron MacIntyre to be, in a way, a deity within the X sphere, as are other people,
Don't do
raw
that.
raw egg nationalists. I know that's not part of your religion, but the point that I'm getting to is that I do believe that there are certain people out there who have the ability to, if they so choose, to go against whatever it is the algorithm may want, and they have enough of a fan base, if you will, enough of a choir that they could preach something that could be different. And I'm not saying that that opportunity has not presented it to yourself, Auron, but in general, it's something that I would love to see a lot more of, just so bad mistakes aren't made. But with that being said, let's bring it over to Devon.
Okay, if I could sort of summarize what I believe Auron is saying here, it's that tribalism isn't the enemy, it's the terrain. And if that is in fact what you're saying, I would wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think tribalism, what we call tribalism, and it's often used as a snarl word, but I don't intend to use it that way. What we call tribalism is what I was talking about when I said, okay, you have plains apes with some inherent instincts. They're going to cluster together with people they know, and they're going to throw rocks at the other plains apes. And that is not eradicable until you start to tamper with the human genome itself technologically. And I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing. It's just a state of play that can produce bad or good things depending on how you engage with it.
This is how gravity
Right.
works.
Yeah. Right now, a lot of the bad things that have been happening are a result of this social engineering, which is the very, excuse me, social engineering at its very core is one of its major ideas is that tribalism is bad and we must defeat it. And that's dumb. If there is a call to action that we could have to produce a society that we want to live in and a future that we want to see, it's how do we leverage the human tribal instinct to create tribes that we want to live in, exclude people who ruin those tribes, and to use those highly organized tribes to advance the human technological state.
To be clear, when I'm talking about tribalism here, I'm not talking about it in the same sense of, people with differences they like to be among each other. I'm specifically referring to the problem that you outlined, Devon, when it comes to people who are the normies that are disgusted by all the things that they're seeing and choose to sidestep the elites to get right to this potential dictator that would do everything that they want. And that is, again, this thing that Auron pointed out.
That's a very particular problem that has nothing to do with the word tribalism. Like, if you are worried about that, that's fine. But the thing
it's a specific tribalism within
it's not. That's not what the word tribalism means. I'm sorry. Like,
let's give it a different word then. That's fine.
Okay,
we can call it something else, but whatever we call it, it's something that's happening right now as a reaction to all the bad things that we're seeing. So whatever we decide to call it, my question is, how exactly can we handle that? And like I said before, I do see this tendency cropping up in a lot of based and red-pilled people. So I don't know, Devon, you understand what I'm saying, right? That the reaction to all of the social engineering is one that's not going to be that hostile to the idea of just giving over all of your rights to a particular top-down entity to then enforce the will of the masses.
Well, I think maybe I understand what your concern is and how it interacts with tribalism. So there are certain groups that have shared goals. So we could call them tribes. And within particular tribes, you can have the shared belief that one of the ways to attain your goals is to centralize power. And in the past, this has sometimes led to some extremely bad effects. And in the past, it has led to some extremely good effects in rarer cases. Like, what's going to happen to the internet when Linus Torvalds dies? The Linux kernel is an autocracy of Linus Torvalds, and it's an extremely benevolent one, even if he's sometimes mean to developers who kind of need him to be mean to them. So, centralized power hasn't always failed to work out, but it often does. And I think that what you may be focusing on, although you may not be interpreting it in quite this way, is that sometimes in the past, a lot of people have found themselves in tribes where the other members of the tribe wanted to centralize power. And certain people in the tribes didn't like that, and they found this very hostile. Like if you were Oscar Wilde in Nazi Germany, or if you were, somebody who just wants to raise a family in Weimar Germany, you would find this very upsetting. So I think that what you see with the sort of internet tribalism is that people are able to organize themselves into smaller tribes that align with their values. Because most political problems boil down to this idea that people are being governed according to not their value. I spent some time living in Washington State, and there are no blue states. There are red states and blue cities. And Washington is a blue state because Seattle can wag the dog in terms of state politics. It can control the state, and it can use the political process to dictate to people who live in a farm 2 hours drive outside Spokane, who have almost no values and almost no needs in common with the people living in Seattle. So the problem here is not that the people in Seattle want to elect insane communists. If Seattle was electing people for Seattle, let them elect all the insane communists they want. Let them turn their city into a hellhole, and then people will start to flood out, and that can be viewed as voting with your feet. The problem is when you're in the wrong tribe. So the more tribes we get, and the more mobility we get between tribes, the more people become able to organize their tribal membership along the lines of the results and the conditions that they want.
I understand what you're saying here. The only problem is if we go back to what Auron was talking about, there seems to be a need for a destroyer of the current system in order to usher in the system of these tribes of...
Absolutely. The problem here is a tribe that won't let you out.
Yes. But then in the process of making that destroyer, how do you prevent that destroyer from, again, being the focal point of everybody's attention and becoming a dictator?
a destroyer can take a lot of different forms. It can take the form of a bigger dinosaur, or it can take the form of a small egg-eating mammal. So to make a concrete example, if we want to talk about the United States federal government, which is basically a massive kleptocracy that a lot of people want out of, the way out of that, to me, that looks like nullification on the state level. Because ultimately, the American federal bureaucracy is dependent on local resources to feed it. It is dependent on local resources to enforce its laws. It is dependent on local resources to do essentially everything it does. Washington, D.C. is a swamp. And I don't mean that metaphorically, the way that Donald Trump describes it. I mean that it is literally a swamp. It is literally a swamp that someone has paved over and stuck a bunch of buildings on top of. It has no logistical or strategic value. It is just a place where people write things down on pieces of paper. Now, right now, those pieces of paper are important, but precisely and only because there is a consensus that those pieces of paper are important, and certain people living in, say, Montana or Tennessee or Idaho agree that these pieces of paper are important. And when you start to demolish that perception, when you start to have local dissent on a small scale, the government can send in thugs to crush it. But when you have dissent on a very broad scale, the resources no longer exist to do that. So a political revolution using force does not necessarily look like a bunch of pickup trucks with MAGA flags driving slowly down the highway towards Washington, D.C., shooting AR-15s in the air and yelling, "Yee-haw." It looks like a bunch of people in Great Falls, Montana, saying, yeah, that law you just passed? We're not going to do that. We're just not going to do that here. And you've already seen this happening. You saw it with marijuana from the left. And you saw it with sanctuary cities from the left. And you're starting to see it with guns from the right. And you notice that whenever this happens, the federal bureaucracy is very careful to avoid provoking a confrontation. States legalize marijuana, and the federal government goes, I'm going to pretend I didn't see that. Because what they're really trying to preserve is the perception that there's anything they can do.
Or with the border, for example, with Texas.
Texas, yes.
They've started enforcing their own border controls. Meanwhile, we see what's going on, with the federal government. And I still have no idea whether it's
Turns out you can just do stuff.
Yeah. I don't know whether it's just like sheer incompetence or whether there is like some organized deep state that's still, tip-top Magoo. But regardless, Auron,
well,
so here...
conservatives are, in a way, sort of shackled by their deep, deep, deep desire for an orderly society where decisions are made by policy. And so they can be very, very slow to adapt to the realization that this condition no longer attains. And, you have to take action yourself instead of trying to change the authority. I remember seeing this one thing on X where somebody went to a hotel with their young kids, and there was this huge inflatable teddy bear, right outside the hotel, sort of decorated as if it was dressed up in full bondage gear with a ball gag.
Yeah.
And they went to the hotel manager and they complained. And somebody told them, well, that's for the Pride Festival in a couple of days, so we're not going to take it down or do anything about it. And it's like, wait a minute. That is a large inflatable teddy bear. I'm pretty sure that your capabilities extend to finding a sharp object somewhere and deflating that bear. But conservatives are attached to this idea that no, you have to follow the rules. Well, realize that the rules are now your enemy. Sometimes you have to realize that it is time to not follow the rules.
And I want to make sure I follow the rules of Auron's Hard Out. Was it
6:30.
6:30, okay. So with that, I want to bring it back to Auron. So what we're talking about here with this I'm not going to enforce this dumb law of yours approach, as opposed to, oh, we're going to have this dictator approach. Do you think that it's possible just to have one and not have the other? Not have this big destroyer that discombobulates everything and now you're forced to do their bidding?
Well, don't get me wrong. Some people want destroyers. Some people want a central authority. There are a lot of people who are inherently submissive and really, really, really want a spanking from mommy.
Or daddy. Yes. But yeah, Auron, any thoughts on that? Can we just have one and not the other?
Yeah, so this is why it's important that you read the books you endorse, Lev, because in the last chapter of my book, I spend the entire time talking about exactly what Devon is suggesting here. The entire point of the book is that I don't think ultimately you will see a strong man come in and transform America. What you will probably see is the continued corruption of the federal government moving in a progressive direction. And the thing that will counteract it is exactly the process Devon is talking about, which is localized governments embracing nullification, embracing self-sustained communities, building a network of alternative institutions that allow them to ignore increasing amounts of the centralized government's dictates. Again, as somebody who lives in Florida and, who lived through the pandemic under Governor DeSantis, I am very aware that the difference a local or state governance makes when it comes to the dictates that are pushed down from on high. So yeah, I think it's critical that they go ahead and have parallel institutions built, that regional solutions are the ones that dominate. That said, would I be sad if there was a national figure that decided to go ahead and smash a large number of the institutions that are currently creating exactly the problem that Devon is talking about? No, I would not. However, their preference is not the issue here, right? Like one of the things that we like to talk about is as if these are careful needles that can be threaded. What we are really facing are world historical forces that have a particular cycle that tends to show itself. Are we moving towards a Caesaristic cycle? Well, yes, for pretty much everything that you see. If you want to look at the Spenglerian cycle or whatever you like to approach it throughout history, we are looking at a scenario that is often broken by the rise of a Caesar figure. When money power, when oligarchy rules, when sclerotic distributed power is that which is creating the very institutions that create social engineering we're talking about, it is very often somebody who comes to power and smashes that enables things. Does that have bad implications often? Yes, it does. But the question is, are those even things that one can decide one way or another? Probably not. So I think it's best either way. The solution on either side is to prepare the local institutions, to prepare to get yourself in order, get your family in order, build the alternative institutions, build the state and local organizations, practice the things that will allow you to go ahead and create the nullification situation Devon's talking about. And then whether the sclerotic government decays from above or whether the opposing Caesar comes in to smash a Leviathan, either way, you will be prepared in your local situation, in your regional situation, to best go ahead and move forward with whatever happens.
The important point in what he's saying here is there's a big difference between what you think will happen on a global scale and what you personally want to do in order to prepare yourself and those you care about to navigate that.
Right.
But let's say, Devon, if you were to be transported back in time to Weimar, Germany, at the risk of invoking Godwin's law, imagine that you were in one of these, German bars with these angry World War I veterans, and you did have an opportunity to, I don't know, voice what you think is the right way to go to people who, see this Hitler figure over there in the corner, who's been sent out by, I don't remember who, to spy on them, and, different ideas are talked about. The point that I'm getting to here is that if you have certain convictions of what you consider to be good versus evil, and you see certain things going on in history, how much of a responsibility do you personally have to intervene in as much of a way as you possibly can in order to not encourage things that you anticipate are going to go down a really bad road, while at the same time also working on a lot of the things that we've talked about here as far as these institutions that don't have much to do with the centralized government and so on?
Well, the question is not if you intervene, but what you do. So you cannot climb on your soapbox and as some people have been doing lately, and tell people, do not act against these forces right now within your society that are causing you acute pain and suffering, because there may be some bad effects to someone else down the road. This someone else being the people who hate you and are making you suffer right now. So, often the Nazi government of Germany is held up as this sort of abstract notion of pure evil. And we have to understand that the Nazi movement was in some ways reactionary to communism. And that becomes a conflict between two alternative forms of evil. And communism is arguably the worse evil. So you don't tell those veterans in the bar, don't do anything. You agree with them about the problems, and you talk about what specifically to do about it. How do you have a proportional movement based on this disgust that you have for what you see happening to your country? That, how do you mitigate that to prevent it from becoming a spiral where you are, not only putting people in camps, but declaring war on the entire world? So, I think we need to realize that the optimum amount of fascism in society may not be 100%. It's not 100%, but it's also not zero. So you don't prevent movements by dismissing all their concerns and trying to suppress them.
Of course, 100%.
You have to acknowledge the real concerns behind it and try to channel that in a positive direction.
But that seems to be the most difficult thing in an age
sure.
of algorithms.
Oh,
because
sure.
there doesn't seem to be that much time to do that.
That is why we need to think about this idea of entering the age of persuasion. Donald Trump can be seen as this Caesaric figure, and the parallels are certainly there, up to the point where there's attempted assassinations and so forth. But what's really unique about him is not him as a man, but the role that he occupies. And the role that he is occupying is someone who stands up and says, inarticulate as he is, what's important is that he's saying it. He's articulating these things that a lot of people are feeling. So don't underestimate the power of the ability to eloquently point out that the emperor has no clothes, because there are a lot of people out there frustrated by this. And if you are someone who stands up and says this, then you have the ability to get people listening to you, and that can affect how they see the solutions to their problems.
Or do you agree with Devon's statement?
What in specific there? There was quite a bit. You'll have to.
There was quite a bit. What I would personally concentrate on is this idea of not having a complete rejection of all of these problems that were talked about back in the Weimar Republic that we're seeing right now, but at the same time balancing out the problem is that most people who are within the reactionary sphere have only a certain amount of hours per day to post, so everything that is being posted and retweeted and so on is, if you are a smart person who wants to make money, it's going to be based on the things that are going to generate the most clicks. And that creates an unfortunate feedback loop where what Devon was talking about right now, like this more nuanced approach, is going to be extremely hard to come by, not even because somebody wouldn't want to do it, but because they may not have enough time. They need to feed their family. They need to generate money. So when we're faced with this problem, and I think it's going to be a lot bigger of a problem as we keep going into the election season and beyond, is there anything that we can do to remedy it? Like, if we're being aware of it right now, can we now figure out a way to balance this out so that what Devon talked about right now could actually occur within this sensocracy, as Alexander Bard calls it, this attention economy?
So you guys probably have noticed that nuance is not the friend of mass politics. There's no value in nuance. It's not that it's not desirable. It's that it's literally a negative to what you're actually trying to do in mass politics. This is why I'm not a fan of mass politics. I think there should be a scenario in which nuance is available to us, but we have not chosen the governmental systems that allow for nuance. We've chosen the governmental systems that demand mass propaganda on a regular basis and creating the sharpest distinctions at all times. So again, the problem you're trying to remedy, Lev, is you want two people who are at total war to have limiting principles.
No, not necessarily. I'm not including a lot of these woke leftist girl boss types. I don't care about them. Who I care about are people who are a lot more, let's say, classically liberal, libertarian, like Devon over here, being able to speak to people who are, further on the reactionary end. I think that is more than doable, and in fact, that's what I've been doing with BTR.
Okay, I'm not really sure what that means, but I guess I'll just say this. What you're trying to avoid is people having a reasonable reaction, right? You're saying you don't want disgust to go out of hand. I understand that. I understand the negative sides of that. The problem is we had about 1,000 off ramps to where we are now, right? Like in the 1980s, the religious right was warning you that everything that was going to happen now was going to happen. And when they were explaining to people that there would be a consequence for ignoring the disgust mechanism in the 80s, no one cared. In fact, not only did they not care, they made fun of those people, they belittled those people, they put the words in the mouths of stupid characters on television until everyone mocked all the people who are warning about exactly the thing that is happening now. And when you ignore all of those warnings for 20, 40, 50 years, and everything keeps happening, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, whoa, I'm worried about the reaction. Then my question is, perhaps you were worried about the wrong thing, because we blew past every sign at which we could have made a reasonable adjustment to the direction of culture in order to mitigate exactly the reaction you're worried about now. And we didn't take any of those action. In fact, we mocked all the people who suggested those minor course corrections that could have saved you from being in exactly the position you're in now. So if you ignore all of those, and then we end up in the position we're in now, and you're like, oh, I can't believe that people are asking for the thing that would actually solve this problem after 50 years of ignoring all of the things that could have solved the problem at a lesser level. I don't really know what to say other than, well, there are consequences, and eventually you get beyond a point at which those consequences will not pay some level of dividend.
Yeah. I'd like to add to that, if I may. First of all, I don't know where you come from, characterizing me as a moderate. I want to throw communists out of helicopters.
See,
That
Devon's
is
more on
not
my
a
side.
joke.
That's still pretty moderate to me, as far as a lot of the other positions that I've seen in this sphere.
But
Yeah.
the principle that Auron is talking about, if I can look at this through an engineering lens, is the faster you catch a software bug, the cheaper and easier it is to fix. And there were many warning signs along the way, as he says, and they were ignored not just by accident, but on purpose. They were ignored on purpose because the decay and chaos serves the purposes of the kleptocracy. And so there is a certain point where the pain becomes unavoidable. So, at a certain point, there's no good advice. Like, I just jumped out of a plane without a parachute. What do I do? Well, don't do that. Well, what do I do in the situation I'm in? Well, spread your arms and legs and hope real hard. So I don't necessarily think that we are at a stage where we need a fascist takeover of the government, but there is a stage at which that becomes inevitable. So I would say the advice that I have is take the first off-ramp. Don't say, oh, well, we can take an off-ramp 30 years from now. And, really absorb this idea that social engineering is bad. And so anytime you see social engineering going on, regardless of whether it points toward the right or the left or in some third direction, you really want to pump the brakes, because that's what tends to get us into these kinds of situations. But I think I agree that what you're doing here is that you're very afraid of tyranny. And, we have these two alternatives of tyranny and chaos. And people tend to be a little more afraid of one or the other. But you're afraid of tyranny. The last thing you want to do is encourage total chaos.
Yes.
Because that makes tyranny seem like a better alternative to people.
Which is exactly why I don't really care that much about talking with people who would refer to themselves as communists for the most part. I instead love talking with people like Auron, for example, because I know that even though we disagree on a lot of things, he still has a much more orderly vision of society that would be safer to live in than the chaotic one.
Yes, well, Auron wants good things for other people. Communists do not want good things for other people. and when it boils down to it, you have to ally yourself with the people who want good things for other people, because those are the people that you can have as neighbors, as opposed to all these people who just like the sound of breaking glass.
As neighbors, absolutely. But if we are talking about political systems over here, the more that I'm engaging in this world, the more it seems to me like it's very small and people are influenced by other people. And there are certain decision makers, within smaller and smaller rings of power within these worlds that I think like talking with people, like going to parties, and some of them may have their minds made up. Others could potentially start to think that maybe there is a way that we don't go into this fascist scape. Maybe there's a way that we can address these problems without that.
Fascism is not the biggest threat right now.
He's not wrong, but it's all there is to it, man. Like, I hear you. I understand. I'm worried about the excesses. I get it. I am also not looking, but again, as we've already said, fascism is a dead ideology anyway. But
You know what he's saying, yeah.
Whatever form of centralized totalitarianism you're worried about, yeah, I'm not looking for that either.
Yeah.
But
No,
as
I
Devin
know you're
points
not.
out, that's just not the worst problem we have at the moment. It's really not. And this is always the thing that is kind of exhausting. I do hear this a lot from a lot of different corners, right? Like, oh, what if the rise of this and that? It's like, look, man, you're living through the rise of something terrible. You exist in this, and all the momentum is moving its direction. I understand the desire to say I don't want the worst possible snapback. Completely reasonable. I don't want that either. But yeah, that is not the priority at the moment.
Yeah, that idea has to inform how you personally snap back. But you need to snap back. You need to deal with the problem that you have. You can't just sit there and twiddle your thumbs and not deflate the giant bondage bear because on principle you want a society of laws where people are not allowed to deface property. And this was something that really jumped out at me when finally the right looked down its trousers and discovered its balls and decided to start canceling people who, were actively expressing the wish that the assassin had succeeded in shooting Trump. It's like, no, let me defend these insane communists on principle. Well, if you're in a fight, your principles are not the first that you have to survive to implement your principles. So principles are about the society you want to create. They're about the world you want to live in. In order for your principles to make any difference at all, you have to survive and you have to get there.
Is there any way you think to do that while making sure to mitigate this fear that I keep bringing up all the time about this totalitarian, authoritarian dictatorship? I think there is. I think it's a much more nuanced approach that's not going to slow things down, because maybe the concern is that, if we're talking about this now, we're not addressing the elephant in the room. I agree, I don't want to not address the elephant in the room as first priority, but there should be a way to do it without, bringing in, again, like this centralized point of focus.
Absolutely. And what I was saying is this is where this metaphor of the engineering process comes in. The sooner you find the bug, the less pain it involves. The sooner you address people's pain points, the less radical the solution has to be, and the less angry they are, and the less they want to see blood.
So, Lev,
what you have to do is get out in front of these things early. And that is what mitigates these massive overcorrections.
The thing that you want to stop, Lev, is more aptly done by having a stronger reaction now rather than a cataclysmic reaction down the road. So what you should be hoping for is a strong, forceful slapback now rather than a complete totalitarian one later on. The reason that the very people you're worried about rise to power every time is not because people want something done. The reason that they rise is that the people in charge, who are supposed to represent the people who want something done, do nothing. And then somebody who is far more drastic comes in later. The problem with the conservative movement is that it's done nothing.
This principle works in every context in life. It works in a marriage. Tell your spouse about that little thing they do that annoys you before you're furious about it. Address your problems with the people you're in social relationships with before you're mad enough to hit them with a tire iron. It's the same thing.
Absolutely, unless that addressing defaults to using the tire iron, which I don't think it will. But there are an awful lot of people.
The earlier you do it, the less likely it is.
Yeah, but Auron was already saying that it's too late.
Well, at what point in the future will it be earlier?
That's
At
an
what
interesting-
point in the
yeah.
future will it be less too late?
Correct.
Yeah, all I'm saying is I just really wanted to emphasize checks and balances within whatever reaction is going to be happening. Is that too much to ask? I don't
Yes,
think it
that's
is.
not how sovereignty works. But yeah, go.
Eventually, it will be too much to ask if
Correct.
we keep diddling around.
Eventually. Okay, so I got two different reactions here. Devin, you said eventually,
it may
or
be too late already. I don't know.
The
But
point-
it's certainly not going to get any earlier if we wait.
The point is, Lev, you're not getting a Trump and Reich. Okay, I'm sorry, but Donald Trump is just not that guy, and he's never going to be that guy. So if you're worried about a over harsh reaction, you should be hoping for a strong Trump reaction now, because behind Trump, somewhere, is somebody much, much more like what you're worried about.
Right now, Trump is the soft option.
Correct. So what you want is to drop the Trump hammer and hope that it breaks the problem now. Because if you don't drop the Trump hammer now, you get exactly what you're worried about later. You think that an empowered or more aggressive executive in the form of Donald Trump is the worst thing you can get.
No,
but
no,
buddy,
I wasn't saying
it's not
that.
even close.
I was
It's
not.
even
I was
close.
not saying that at all. It's all a gradient. No, but I understand the points that you guys are bringing up. But what I wanted to bring up right now is biltong. If you go to biltongusa.com, Anton's biltong, I guarantee you guys, you have never had a snack. It's not even a snack. It's a life force. That's what biltong is. So the super chat $30 from King of Biltong goes as follows. Good afternoon from Anton's Meet and Eat. Free shipping for your biltong using code BTR on our website Lev will provide. And provided I have biltongusa.com. It's a South African jerky. Devin, Auron, have you guys had it yet?
I cannot say that I have.
I cannot say that I have, but
Well,
they're paying for content you like, so show them some love.
Oh, absolutely. They're great, wonderful people as well. They're also big fans of Styx Hexenhammer 666, who I am sure you guys are aware of. And lastly, before we get to the promotions of you guys, tomorrow a Patreon stream with Jared Klickstein. Now, I don't know if you guys know Jared's story, but he was homeless, he was in the state of abusing hard drugs, and he ended up coming out of it, so we're going to be talking about this with him, as well as thoughts that he has on the homelessness and drug epidemic in the United States right now, as well as some of these seedy politicians that are enabling this to happen. And with us, we're also going to have Armand Domolensky, who is a activist on the Democrat side, and we are also going to have from the Good Old Boys podcast, Bog Beef. So that's going to be tomorrow. Patreon.com/break the rules. I am going to provide the link in the description as well as over here, and as soon as this show is over, you're going to have a redirect link which contains the Patreon link as well. So be sure to go there. Here's the Patreon link right in the chat. Click that right now. So anyway, I think this was an amazing conversation, but now I think it's time for plugs, because Auron, it's almost time for you to go. So let us know what you're working on, as well as also your book, which I have not finished reading, so I did not get up to that part, but it is a very enjoyable read. And the book is called The Total State: How Liberal Democracies Become Tyrannies, and I'm putting the link in the chat as well. So let us know about the book, as well as what you're working on right now, brother.
No, I just had to rib on you because Devin was giving exactly my answer to the question you were asking, and you were asking him like it was an alternative when it was exactly what I said. But anyway, yes, they got the book, The Total State. Like you said, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, Target, all these stores. You can go ahead and get there. Also have the show over on Blaze TV, the podcast, and just had an article go up on the Blaze. So if people want to read that, they can check it out.
Nice. And Devon Eriksen, not only do you have the book Theft to Fire on Amazon, but you're also having a Kickstarter for the audiobook.
Yes, we are actually in active recording for the audiobook right now. I have found 3 amazing voice actors, so we're going to produce something really cool.
You're not doing the voice of Warnick yourself?
I am not. You'll understand when you hear the guy who's doing it.
Yeah. And could you tell us just a little bit about what it is, real quick, before Auron goes?
Theft to Fire is a love letter to classic science fiction. I wasn't done with the science fiction of the 20th century that was so good and was hopeful and was about the future and what we might do. And I was tired of reading post-apocalyptic dystopian crap, so I rolled out my sleeves and said, okay, I'll do it myself. Theft of Fire, available wherever books are sold. Sequel coming out late this year, early next year.
Nice. Guys, get Theft of Fire, get The Total State, and be sure to subscribe to this channel as well as Auron's channel if you guys have not. I can't believe you guys didn't. As well as go to the X accounts of Auron and Devon and Instagram and whatever. And lastly, of course, patreon.com/breaktherules. I'm going to be having episodes in New York City. I just did one, as I said before, with Raheem Kassam. That episode's going to be coming out next week. Look forward to that. And then general $20 patrons, if you guys are within the New York City area, you can actually take part in the studio. I'll bring you to my condo after getting to know you first, because you could be like a crazy person who just came out of a mental institution where you had a phone and were watching BTR all day. So I want to make sure that you're actually kosher to come in first. But either way, we're going to be having, guests there speaking, an audience in the condo, and then we're going to have a rooftop party, which is a lot of fun with drinks and merriment and all that. The weather's finally cooling down in New York City, hopefully within the next couple of weeks. So we're going to be arranging one with Jason, Resiger, Johnny in New York City. So once again, patreon.com/breaktherules. Become a patron today. And that's it. A wonderful episode. I really enjoy talking with both of you guys. Auron, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. Devon, it is a great pleasure to finally meet you and talk with you. And I look forward to talking with you guys even more as the months roll in with this crazy time we're living in right now.
Good meeting you both, or good meeting Devon. Good talking to you, man.
Yes, absolutely. Had great fun today.
Take care, guys. Mwah!